Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you all taking time out of your day to join us for our 10th installment of our webinar series. We're going to talk a little bit about urban riparian restoration. Not all projects and partnerships are created equal, and they each have their pros and cons and challenges and benefits. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the urban restoration and partnerships that we're working on here at RiversEdge West, a few of the things that we learned. Hopefully this information will be valuable to you all. So I want to thank Rika Fulton, our restoration coordinator for the Desert Rivers Collaborative, and the coordinator for the Dolores River Restoration Partnership. She's going to talk a little bit about her experiences and working in that urban setting and conducting restoration and fostering partnerships. So a little bit before we start, while people are signing on, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little bubble icon, the chat box. We'll be posting some links to information in that chat box. This is where you guys will put in all your questions for Rika and the other staff. We're going to have a number of staff on the webinar to help answer those questions and get information to you. If we can't get you that information, we'll circle back with you offline and link you up with that information. So enter your questions there. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I think what we're going to do is, if we leave our mics muted and our video feeds off, we can focus on the presentation, and it won't toll so much on our on each of our Wi-Fis, which we know happens quite often. So again, I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro about kind of where we're at with one of our restoration partnerships that we're going to be talking about today. So again, thank you all for joining us. So today, Rika is going to talk a little bit about one of our a case study of a partnership called the Desert Rivers Collaborative. So this is a kind of a project and a partnership that got created within the Grand Valley here in Mesa County, Colorado. The centerpiece of this partnership is really two rivers, the Gunnison and the Colorado, and the confluence that happens smack dab in the middle of this partnership. When our organization got going back in the late 90s, many of you may or may not know that our former name was called the Tamarisk Coalition. And we were born out of a subgroup of an organization called the Riverfront Commission, who was working on developing a trail system in the valley. And one of the objectives and tasks for the subgroup, the Tamarisk group, was to really look at the invasive species that are really encroaching along the Colorado and Gunnison River in the Grand Valley. I'll save the long story, but we've definitely expanded our services and our work across the West. But what we did was this group really codified the need to have a forum and a group that can work on specific objectives within a partnership. And what this did was bring people together. We early on knew that we needed to bring people together to talk about what municipalities were doing, what the county was doing, what objectives other NGOs had for the valley. And so in about 2012, 2013, we assembled the Desert Rivers Collaborative into a functional collaborative working partnership that really brought together all the partners, all the values, kind of under one umbrella, so we can learn from each other. We can understand what other jurisdictional boundaries people are working in. It allowed us to communicate within this forum, allowed us to share lessons learned and communicate about successes and failures. And so I think in that urban context, a case study like the Desert Rivers Collaborative was really born out of the need for a higher level of communication and collaboration because of the complexities and the challenges of working in an urban setting. And so that's really, I think, what underpins a lot of what Rika is going to talk about. And that's really why a partnership like the Desert Rivers Collaborative got started. So with that, I'm going to kind of stop. I hope that's a little bit of a context for you, at least in our neck of the woods here in Grand Junction and Mesa County. And I'll turn it over to Rika, and she can talk about a lot of the. She'll drill down into a lot more of what it means to have an urban restoration partnership. So, Rika, thank you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rusty, for the intro, and everyone for tuning in. Like Rusty said, my name is Rika Fulton. I'm a restoration coordinator with RiversEdge West, and I coordinate the Desert Rivers Collaborative and the Dolores River Restoration Partnership, both very different. So today I'm going to be talking about the challenges and benefits associated with urban riparian restoration, with a focus on the Grand Junction area in the Grand Valley. As most of the documented riparian restoration projects in the country occur in more remote areas, urban restoration, especially at a watershed scale, presents a host of unique factors and constraints that really necessitate a unique approach to restoration, techniques themselves, but also even more so in the process and the ways that you communicate with other people to get those goals realized. So I'm going to talk today about first some generalized background on what urban riparian restoration really is and why we want to restore those areas in the first place. So I'll go into a little more detail on the Desert Rivers Collaborative, or the DRC, discuss some challenges and opportunities associated with urban riparian restoration, and then finally talk about our forthcoming Stewardship Framework, which is kind of a product that we are just starting to develop that will be a really good tool for entities undertaking riparian restoration, whether urban or not. Urban riparian restoration is a management strategy, in a sense, that can be used to assist in alleviating pressures of human development and urban stressors on stream and ecological ecosystems, or can be defined as efforts to reestablish lost hydrologic and ecosystem functions. So this differs from other riparian restoration that occurs in more remote areas, given the numerous physical and cultural factors that influence the riparian area. Within the last 30 years or so, people have really started to identify the value of healthy river systems, and the value they have to all life, wildlife, habitat, to agriculture. However, anthropogenic or human-caused stressors or actions have, in some cases, really influenced the quality of riverside areas and rivers themselves. So particularly in the West, where minimal rainfall and precipitation is received, human development in urban living areas are often really close to rivers and on the banks of rivers, which has an impact. It can be pretty difficult to restore stream ecosystems in these environments because of all of the interactions that occur between resulting urbanized hydrology and ecosystem responses. So many researchers describe this as the urban stream syndrome, which characteristics include flashier hydrograph, elevated concentrations of nutrients and contaminants, altered channel morphology, and reduced biotic richness, with more frequently that are dominated by tolerant species. Tolerant species are often invasive and include tamarisk and Russian olive, like we see a lot here in the Grand Valley, as well as a lot of secondary herbaceous weeds. These urban streams and rivers are often adjacent to infrastructure such as roads, trails, sewage, irrigation, which all impact the geomorphology and ecology of the waterway. So in some cases, vegetation has been removed already for development, or those invasives, like I talked about, have really taken over, and those continue to propagate. So all these factors together really influence what strategies for restoration will work, and more importantly, limit where these efforts are even feasible. So why do we want to restore anyways, and why is this important? First, we want to ensure rivers are able to function and support ecosystems that include ourselves. So these increasingly urbanized regions have led to a degradation of areas throughout the country, including development, of course, as well as large water diversions and other factors which have altered these areas. And it's kind of imperative that we work within those constraints with restoration, since it's really hard to change those. So planning and zoning and flow regimes are constraining factors. An increase in vegetation species can be seen in most waterways over the past century. Brush and olive and tamarisk, like I mentioned, but also other species like tree of heaven, purple loosestrife, Siberian elm, Ravenna grass are all examples, and often those are introduced from ornamental gardens or folks bringing them in, and so it's important to make sure those are mitigated and don't take the place of native species. And a lot of folks do a great job of maintaining that. Another obvious reason is, animals are becoming extinct at an increasing rate, which is kind of alarming. So we really want to make sure that some habitat exists, even in urban areas, even if it's small. So there are plenty of opportunities for recreation, aesthetics, and habitat projects to kind of coincide. And oftentimes in urban areas, species that are able to adapt to disturbance will be the only ones thriving. So we want to make sure to take care of those sensitive species as well, and really plan for whatever disturbance happens in the future. Urban riparian restoration is a lot more complicated than just improving that animal habitat because of all those other factors. Erosion is a huge one. We want to make sure that's all mitigated around infrastructure. So it's combining restoration and erosion protection all at once, which can be tricky, and I'll talk about that more later on. Furthermore, kind of an obvious one that rings true, especially this year, is restoration in the form of reducing biomass, which can reduce the risk of wildfire in urban interfaces. Tamarisk burns really, really hot, so that can be super hazardous if a fire is started. So by removing tamarisk and Russian olive, we can really help protect cottonwoods and other desirable native plant species, as well as, of course, protect property and water quality and all of those things. So that's a huge benefit of restoration. Vegetation also helps mitigate flood events and has the potential to reduce the impact of flood events whenever they do occur. So it's important to keep track of, intact wetlands and floodplains wherever that's possible. Obviously, recreation is a huge benefit to restoration, and it can benefit all kinds of students, but all kinds of people, not just students, but all residents, can really benefit from witnessing a restoration project occur over time on an area that they visit a lot. And then finally, vegetation can help absorb or filter some pollutants and contaminants that are associated with runoff water from impermeable surfaces, and can really help protect water quality. And when there is good, solid riparian vegetation, it'll help absorb some of those before they make it in the channel. So like many things, riparian restoration in urban areas is a balance between different land uses. And in a lot of these areas, land use codes already exist and delegate where development can occur, but it is important to become engaged with those processes wherever possible. And it's important that some areas are left undeveloped, both for access and the enjoyment of people, but also to give the river space. Like I mentioned, large rivers such as the Colorado and Gunnison Rivers, they might someday flood, and it's kind of a matter of when, not if. And so it's important to identify those floodplains and make sure that the river has space to move where that's possible, because it will anyways, so it's better to be prepared. Another point about restoration is the lag between when invasives are removed and when natives are established. So it's just important to remember that balance and communicate the expectations with your partners when you are undertaking restoration. So Rusty mentioned the Desert Rivers Collaborative, the DRC already, but I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the role of collaboration in urban restoration, and the DRC serves as a really good case study for that. So the partnership was formed in 2012 and includes over 20 partners from municipalities such as Grand Junction, Fruita, and Palisade, counties, nonprofits, federal and state agencies like the BLM and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, private landowners, and more. It serves as a platform to connect on restoration efforts, apply for funding, coordinate, and agree on a shared set of restoration goals. We have a really in-depth implementation plan that's worth taking a look at. It's a good platform to execute trainings and workshops under share lessons learned. Under the partnership, we keep track of metrics. So the amount of acres of tamarisk and Russian olive removed, secondary weeds, any revegetation that occurs, which really helps keep track of on a watershed scale of what's going on and how we can connect those projects. And it also really enables us to work together with a variety of land ownership jurisdictions, from private landowners to the federal government, which really helps to leverage funding and resources and help with those monitoring and maintenance needs. For example, if the chipper at Palisade is needed somewhere else, we can coordinate within the partnership to make sure that, resources are shared effectively, which is super helpful and makes projects go a lot smoother. So it's really different from other partnerships because of the urban nature of the work and all the different landowners and managers and land designations. For example, the city of Grand Junction and Colorado Parks and Wildlife may have different goals for their properties that they manage. One being for wildlife and one being a safe place for people to recreate. So it's important knowing that going in. When I compare this with the Dolores River Restoration Partnership that I work on, it's totally different, because with that we're primarily working with the BLM and maybe a few private landowners, but it's a lot easier to work on a landscape scale, where here in town it's a little bit more nuanced. Here's just quickly a map of the jurisdiction of the DRC. It's the Colorado and Gunnison Rivers and all the tributaries in Mesa and Delta County. So I wanted to provide a few examples of projects that we've done in the past. This first one is in the town of Palisade at Riverbend Park. And it really kind of illuminates the unique nature of restoration in the Grand Valley. And Palisade's always been a fun place to work. So this project was in around 2012, because in 2011, which was a really high water year, a flood event washed away a huge portion of the bank. So in subsequent years, this project was implemented that used a stinger bar, which is the big bar you see in the photos, to insert willows way down through the riprap, which is what those big boulders are called. So that provides native vegetation as well as stabilization. So it still looks good today, and the willows are definitely thriving. Oftentimes, erosion and flooding is a large issue in urban settings. So this does create some nuance, because sometimes tamarisk and Russian olive can actually provide as a buffer against erosion. So projects like this show that there is kind of a good in-between. There's also some other kind of interesting bioengineering techniques in general out there that involve a lot of woody material that help stabilize banks, mitigate erosion, and also support fish populations and provide additional shade and channel complexity. So it's kind of fun to see all of the different options that are out there. And here's a more recent photo of that site with some of the willows. They're actually even bigger now, but it's fun to see how that project progressed. Here's another one on Watson Island. This was one of the earlier projects of RiversEdge West, then Tamarisk Coalition. And this is kind of a classic example of what Watson Island used to be. It was kind of a junkyard. It's in the center of town, really inaccessible. As you can see in the photo, kind of impossible to get to the river. It's full of tamarisk and Russian olive, and the cottonwoods that you can see standing taller than the rest are, you know, totally choked in. And then here's what it looked like after restoration. And now you can see it illuminates all of the values that the DRC has. You know, now it's recreation. It's really visible, provides better habitat. It's in the middle of a really braided section, so it gives the river some space to move into that area at higher flows. Yeah, so that's a great example of what a restoration project looks like. So I would be remiss not to at least mention population growth. As more people move into these areas in the West and Western Colorado, it's really imperative that we think about restoration and long-term planning now before it's too late, because restoration, you know, is kind of a long game. The State Demographer's Office did a study, I believe in 2017, that found that Colorado's western slope is projected to grow by 2/3 by 2050, so a lot more people, and about a quarter of that increase will occur in Mesa County. So we could potentially get another 80,000 people in the next 30 years, and you know, if those numbers are correct, it's a lot more people. That will put a lot more stress on the Colorado River and other streams in the area. So the Colorado River District and other entities are really doing a great job of planning for the quantity of water and, you know, less water with more people, but it's really our job as people interested in restoration and to make sure that those healthy ecosystems are preserved and restored, because they'll just do better if they're more resilient. So I've mentioned some challenges already, but in a lot of ways, restoration along streams in urban areas is more challenging than in remote waterways. First, multiple land use goals, managers and owners, you know, can create complexity as each parcel has different land use designations like recreation, private, industrial, or many others. So combining these goals is challenging, but it's important to understand the objectives of everyone involved in a project before moving forward, taking any major actions towards restoration. Otherwise, the project will likely not be very sustainable. Therefore, collaborative or overarching goals need to be really flexible and adaptive. And site prioritization schemes need to be pretty pragmatic and really take into account land designation and future potential uses before we really go all gung-ho and understand that nothing in an urban area is going to be fully restored. It's going to always be a balance. And long-term planning really needs to coincide with restoration starting now. So, you know, think long-term planning while still working with these projects. Another challenge that can be really time-consuming is obtaining permits from federal or local agencies that are often required before doing work, whether that be working in a wetland or an Army Corps permit for doing any bank stabilization work, or an environmental assessment or impact statement. So those can be kind of tricky in town. On the Dolores, for example, sometimes those are a little bit more straightforward because you can kind of do one environmental assessment on a much larger area, and it's good for a longer amount of time. So it's good to always be aware of that before diving into a project. Funding is obviously always a challenge, no matter what restoration project, and that's probably not going to get any better in recent years. So, you know, land managers, counties, and municipalities often don't have the capacity or resources to take on additional restoration projects. So it's also important to note that a lot of grants and funding don't always go beyond 3 years, which is sometimes not enough to complete full restoration goals. Therefore, pooling resources and working with partners can really help diversify funding sources and share the responsibility of maintaining a site, which is really important. Another challenge that a lot of folks have is monitoring and maintenance. it's sometimes a lot easier to get funding for an initial restoration project and less easy to get monitoring and maintenance funding. And then, you know, of course, it's also tricky with different landowners who have different maybe ways of approaching a project, or of course lack the capacity to actually maintain those projects. For example, you know, we haven't always been able to get consistent monitoring data within the Desert Rivers Collaborative area, which is something we're hoping to work on next year. But that really helps how we gauge restoration success on the Dolores, for example, is having that really solid monitoring data that puts some numbers behind restoration and making sure that it's working, our ecological goals are being achieved, rather than it being, you know, sort of subjective. Another challenge that we have in urban areas is soil and water quality. Oftentimes soils in urban areas, you know, maybe used to have some kind of industry or pollutant on site. So if you're not sure before you're doing any revegetation, it's always good to get your soils tested, just to make sure, because certain things might not be able to grow. And there also tends to be higher levels of sedimentation just from urban runoff, which is important to know as well. And then, of course, the major one is climate change. We know that the quantity of water in the Colorado River Basin is set to decline pretty substantially in coming years. So we're still learning what that means for vegetation along the river. You know, monsoons really aren't occurring as they used to. Soil's been really dry. You know, the whole state, the whole West is in a drought. So we really need to find out more ways about how we can adapt species to this drought, a future with less water. So that's something we're still constantly learning about, and it will kind of inevitably be trial and error, but that's going to be probably the biggest challenge. So on a positive note, there are a lot of benefits to restoration in urban areas, especially being within a collaborative group. So there's a lot of opportunities to engage folks in education and stewardship that you don't have in remote areas, which is really fun to connect the community with their environment. Second, I have found that it's actually a lot easier to find properties that can irrigate revegetation projects than in remote areas, which leads to a lot higher success. So that's been really nice working in the Grand Valley for that reason. Third, there's a ton of space for creativity. For example, the nexus of recreation and restoration has some really cool opportunities, as does, you know, the ability to incorporate bank stability and restoration, like that example at Palisade. Other benefits are relationship building. So in many cases, different entities wouldn't otherwise really communicate without having the DRC platform. And so even further, these efforts can lead to other like spin-off groups. For example, a couple of years ago, the Two Rivers Wildfire Coalition was formed, which encompasses some of the similar stakeholders that the DRC has. Similarly, a pollinator garden was developed, as well as there is now a group looking to initiate a river corridor planning, which goes back to what I was talking about, the importance of long-term planning as it relates to, you know, projected population growth. So all of those things are kind of tied into the DRC, which is pretty cool. So quickly, I'm going to talk about our forthcoming stewardship framework, which we're really excited about. We received funding from Colorado Water Conservation Board, Walton Family, and Bacon Family Foundations to support this development. And this really hinges on the fact that there's already been a lot of work put into restoration in the valley and elsewhere. And, you know, probably understanding that we're going to have less resources in the future. So how can we do more with less? So this will be a really cool tool, which will be a framework that'll be, you know, pretty flexible depending on your needs. And it'll be a really useful guide to effectively restore riparian areas, you know, urban or remote, provide a bunch of resources that will guide those interested in restoration, from planning, monitoring, implementation, site prioritization, and provide suggestions for sustainable funding opportunities. It's kind of a one-stop shop of sorts for anyone at any point in their restoration journey of sorts. So we understand that true restoration takes a really long time. So this is going to be a really helpful tool no matter where you are, and can potentially help save funding. For example, some individuals may just be looking for a rapid assessment monitoring protocol, in which case this would point them towards a few different options and what they would be useful for. Similarly, some groups may find the adoption of an online geodatabase to be really helpful as they progress into more restoration. That's a tool that we use that's so helpful, is where we store monitoring and treatment data in an easy to use geodatabase. So that will be a component of this as well. So we hope to have this product in place by next spring or so. It will help us continue to drive the work in the DRC and on the Dolores, and we hope elsewhere in the West as well. So stay tuned for more on that. And then, of course, I wanted to mention a really fun aspect of urban riparian restoration, which is having the ability to engage with local communities and people. So, for example, we were able to organize a handful of small volunteer events this year with our partners, which allows people to kind of come out and help and continue to be interested in stewardship. You know, it can sometimes be challenging to find good projects, but we have really good partners, and makes that work more fun. And Kara, our outreach and education coordinator, has done an awesome job organizing those, especially this year, which COVID has made it a little bit trickier, but it kind of makes it more special to be out there with some different folks. We built some bird boxes, and then did a handful of weed pulling events as well throughout the Grand Junction area. So finally, I wanted to just kind of summarize lessons learned after working with the DRC about kind of what works. The first and maybe most importantly is having one coordinating entity that's able to keep track of metrics and share information, you know, help with fundraising, keep a list of projects, list resources such as where to source plants, or different labor sources that are available, and cost estimates, organizing meetings and events, and then just providing overall technical assistance to people that need it is really important. And next, this might be obvious, but communication between partners is super important when there are a lot of people involved. It's kind of a heightened level of communication rather than other areas. You know, anything from ensuring permits are in place to making sure that the public and other managing entities are all aware and engaged in projects. And then certainly just to make sure that the long-term expectations are all out on the table prior to starting a restoration project, knowing that it goes far beyond that one initial project, and there has to be resources and the energy out there to continue to maintain the project. It's really important to be flexible. Projects always sort of change a little bit, but that being said, over planning from the get-go never hurts, and I'd always recommend that. Leveraging funding and working together on grant applications is really important. One, funders really like to see collaboration work, and it really makes funding go further, and it makes projects a little bit more fun to have you know, other people involved, and those tend to be really successful. Already kind of talked about this, but it's good to be creative and figure out how projects can meet multiple goals. Working with private landowners is also really important and takes a lot of work and relationship building. And, you know, of course, everyone's different. So we're filling that gap within RiversEdge West by rehiring for a new private lands person who works with RiversEdge West and on NRCS. And that will really help landowners with technical information and work, you know, with coordinators such as myself on how they can hinge into larger landscape restoration work. And then, you know, maybe the biggest thing is just being realistic. When it comes to some sites, you know, you're never going to get pre-development characteristics back. There's always going to be in a city. So you know, you just have to think realistically. For example, you know, you might need to plant xeric plants where once there was more riparian species. So just being a little bit flexible and understanding that, you know, it's not going to be pristine is really important. And finally, we have a lot of this resources on our website. So definitely take a look at our resource center. There's a lot of guides on how to plant, where to plant, what species to plant, cost tools, and yeah, definitely reach out to us with any questions. And that is all I have.
Right, thanks, Rika. Appreciate all the information. So I want to remind everyone in the chat box, upper right-hand corner of the bubble, please enter any of your questions you have for Rika or any of the other staff that we have on the line. So go ahead and enter those questions in there. Rika, I have a quick question. Maybe you can touch on it. You know, we've learned that it's important to balance the resources for capacity and implementation and monitoring and maintenance. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the importance of the balance of those funding resources for each of those things for a partnership? You know, we have to get work done. We have to have people to do it. You know, we need to keep an eye on our projects. Could you just touch a little bit about that and how we do that in not only urban restoration, but in partnership models in general?
Yeah, sure. That's, I think, probably the key to that is thinking ahead and having a really comprehensive budget when you're going into kind of grant applications. And sometimes it's easy to have all of a sudden have a lot of funding for 1 year that's for a specific project or contractor or plant materials, but then you find that you're maybe lacking in funding for coordination or something like that. So I think that the key to that, which, you know, is always kind of changing, is having that really long-term budget for all your programs and working a year in advance about knowing what you want to do and where your target areas are. And yeah, it's definitely challenging. Like right now we have a lot of funding for seed, where, you know, you got to make sure that the timing falls correctly with the funding. And that's another key to that is also just communication and knowing what people need for their properties and things like that.
Great. We have a question here. Do you find a lot of enthusiasm in the community for getting these urban riparian restoration projects done? And then the second part, are these projects generally initiated by the community or the landowners themselves, or by RiversEdge West, or by agency partners?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think overall there's always been enthusiasm for projects, and it's a mix. Like we actually have a lot of private landowners come to us saying like, hey, we'd like to do this project, and, you know, depending on what resources are available, we always try to help. Certainly there are areas that we kind of have worked on before, and so we try to continue to maintain. So we certainly initiate some of them, and some of them based on work that we've done that we know have a high quality for good habitat. So that's kind of a priority for us. So it's a mix. I think everyone's always really excited about it, but sometimes it comes from partners and sometimes it comes from us.
Yeah, great question, Kelsey. You know, I think the first part of your question is, do you find a lot of enthusiasm in the community for getting these urban riparian restoration projects done? You know, I think the key to that is if we have done our homework about outreaching, creating awareness, and articulating what the values and the objectives of the project are, I think we find a lot more enthusiasm. If we have not done a good job doing that, you know, generally you risk, I think, people coming out against it, that it wasn't either talked about in either an open forum or a transparent manner. So I think if you can get people talking about your project and use accustomed to some of the work getting done, I think you'll find a lot more enthusiasm around those. And you know, I think the second part of your question, as Rika said, you know, the genesis of these projects come from many different angles, and I think that's the best way for it to happen. If it's always driven or ramrodded by one organization or agency, you know, I think we wouldn't have a lot of backing and support for these community projects. So great question. Rika, we have another question here. What methods do you use to recruit private landowners?
Good question. Certainly, like existing relationships has been one. You know, if we already know them, or you know, one of our partners knows private landowners, that's kind of the first and easiest way to engage. Secondly, via our NRCS partner position, that enables landowners to reach out to NRCS, and then we can get connected through those channels to help them with technical resources, where we'll have someone maybe go out to their property and provide just some advice, potentially try to help with funding resources. But as kind of basic as that sounds, really it comes down to relationship building and trust and who knows who. And then, yeah, Rusty, you might have more to add to that, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think some other ways, we definitely use the people that interface with private landowners, you know, regularly. I think, you know, having those relationships already built, and maybe those people are able to introduce us to those landowners, I think is a great way to do that. You know, I think generally speaking, you know, we try not to cold call or knock on doors. Really, you know, we want to utilize existing relationships. So that means there's probably trust and good working relationships already built with those partners. And I think that's kind of some of the special qualities about building a partnership together is you can bring those people in, kind of like the Desert Rivers Collaborative, you know, the Mesa County Weed Coordinator, you know, they have a lot of good existing relationship with landowners. The conservation districts, the NRCS, you know, we really want to turn over all those stones where we can tap those people that have already had those good working relationships and trust built. So, and then we want to continue to build those relationships ourselves. So that's kind of how we do recruit. I think one of the key things about private landowners is you need to meet them where they are. Private landowners are extremely busy people trying to make a living. And so I think you need to recruit them or communicate with them where they are, and make it as easy as possible on them to interact with you, because they're just, you know, they're 24/7 trying to produce and make a living. So I think that's an important aspect in working with landowners. So are there any other questions that people have? Okay, Rika, that's all the questions we have. Thank you very much for your presentation. In the chat box, we sent several links to the Desert Rivers Collaborative, the plans and implementations. So check out all that information, and feel free to reach out to Rika or any of us at RiversEdge West if you have further questions about this. So with that, I would like to thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you consider becoming a member of RiversEdge West. You can find that information on our website. Those membership dollars help us provide these cost-effective or free webinar series like you saw today. So consider becoming a member of our organization. We put those dollars to good use and try to get that information out to the people that need that and that are doing work on the land. So thank